Hi, I'm Doug Sovereign from KCBS Radio. Welcome to a forum on Measure R, which is on the ballot in November. Today's forum is sponsored by the Contra Costa Elections Division, Contra Costa Television, the League of Women Voters of Diablo Valley, and the League of Women Voters of West Contra Costa County. We're recording these roundtables here in the studio of Contra Costa Television. Measure R asks, shall the county tax cannabis, marijuana, businesses in the unincorporated area at annual rates up to $7 per canopy square foot for cultivation, adjustable for inflation, and up to 4% of gross receipts for all other cannabis businesses, including retailers, to generate an estimated $1.7 to $4.4 million annually to fund general county expenses such as public safety, health services, and environmental protection, and levied until repealed by the voters or the Board of Supervisors. Representing the measure today are in favor of the measure Contra Costa County Supervisor Karen Mitchoff, and against the measure, President of the COCO Tax Organization, Jack Weir. We drew lots before the show to determine the speaking order, so we will begin with Karen Mitchoff. Thanks for being with us, and let's begin by explaining from your point of view, why should people vote for this measure?
We need people to support this measure because in Contra Costa County, over 60% of the voters voted to legalize marijuana. And in order to implement the provisions of that ballot measure, we need additional funding for the law enforcement that will be necessary for the environmental impacts, so we can go out and review, as we do restaurants and other types of public environments, if you will, where the public is, and for those who will need either new or additional mental health, substance abuse services.
And Jack Weir, Contra Costa County Taxpayers Association, why should people vote against it?
There are a couple of major reasons why we think this is a very bad idea. Setting aside the actual the issue of the legalization of marijuana, we've discovered that there's a very serious unintended consequence from the legalization of marijuana. One of the reasons we think people voted to legalize marijuana was to minimize the flow of illegal drugs in from the southern border. And we find that as governments impose fees and costs associated with the legal growing and sales of marijuana, it allows those drug cartels to use the black market and actually undercut the prices. And so recent Border Patrol reports show larger amounts of illegal drugs flowing in across the southern border than before. So we think that's a major issue. In addition, the real elephant in the room behind why the county wants this and many other new taxes across the county is because of the enormous unfunded pension obligation that the county and the cities and the state, for that matter, have accumulated over decades. And that's the real, or one of the very real financial elephants in the room behind this issue.
Karen, I want you to clarify something for us because there's some confusion among taxpayers. What happens if voters reject this tax? What does that mean for the county's recreational marijuana law?
It means that we won't implement along the lines of the proposition that was on the ballot a few years ago. If we don't have the funds to address the, Jack uses the term unintended consequences for other issues, we feel it's our fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayer that the users of this product should be the ones paying for the costs of the product to the local taxpayer.
So without the tax, the law goes away and recreational marijuana will not be legal in Contra Costa County? Correct. Is that a fair assessment? I mean, apart from whether people support legal marijuana or not, you need the tax to implement the law, right? So if the law is on the books and people support it, why not have the tax to make it possible?
There are a couple of reasons. And if I'm sniffling this morning, is because I'm suffering a terrible attack of tax allergies. On the November ballot, there are 25 measures, half of which, roughly half of which are state, the other half are local. Most of them impose a new tax. And as we talk to taxpayers and businesses, people are becoming numb at the constant flood of new requests for taxes of all and every imaginable kind. And so the basic issue here is, why can't government live within its means the way we expect working families to, rather than constantly nibbling at new fees and new taxes? And we think this also may explain why there's relatively low voter turnout these days. Frankly, voters are numb, residents are numb at the constant demands for government at all levels for more and more and more taxes. And this is just one of 25 measures that voters will have to deal with on a ballot, assuming they take the time to read a 200-page voter guide. And for people that commute 2 hours a day and work, you know, it's just, it's too much. So we think this is a good example of a bad tax.
But Karen, in this case, if you don't use the marijuana, you don't buy the marijuana, you don't pay the tax, right?
Correct. And one thing that's very interesting, and why I love my job, I learn something all the time. We have to ask all the voters in the county, not just the unincorporated. Actually, this is considered a referendum on the current taxing structure. So. Someone who lives in a city, in an incorporated city, will still be asked to vote about this, but it will only impact the cultivation and/or distribution and sale in the unincorporated area. So I actually agree with Jack. The voters are getting very tired of all these taxes. I don't approve of every one that's out there. I actually voted against RM3 on the recent ballot because it isn't about living within our means. It's about utilizing the funds and providing a product. Not to go into RM3, that's already been done there, but
regional measure.
I do understand why local jurisdictions are putting in these taxes, and we can have a discussion another time on their value, but I believe it's up to us to allow the voter to make that decision.
And so people do understand that. This, again, is for the unincorporated areas of Contra Costa County. So if you live in Concord, if you live in Martinez, this will not apply to you. So what are the areas that are covered?
Well, I want to make, it's very, people aren't all that understanding of, if you live in Martinez, but you go to Pacheco, which is an unincorporated area, and there's a dispensary there, you will pay a tax. I understand the city of Martinez is looking into something similar, and so if you live in Martinez and you purchase a product in Martinez, you will.
Well, I meant, yeah, I said live.
No,
yes,
I understand.
It's where the business is.
But where the business is or where you purchase the product, right. Unincorporated areas, actually my, is if the county's unincorporated area was actually a city, it would be the largest city geographically in the county. So a lot of, I will say, because I just was looking at our agenda, this will not impact the community of Knightson. They asked out in Far East County not to have this, so that has been excluded. But any unincorporated area, we have 19 cities, but Pacheco, Clyde, Alamo. Out in East County, Discovery Bay is an unincorporated community, as is Bethel Island, and then some areas of West County.
So everyone in the county is being asked to vote on this tax, but it only applies to certain areas within the county. So while you may, and your organization may oppose taxes in general that you find excessive, why isn't this one fair if it's only really a user tax?
Well, part of the problem, there are two problems I want to address. One is I may live in a city and wander anywhere in the county to make purchases of various kinds. So if a product is taxed in one area and 50 feet away it's not taxed, that leads to confusion. The other thing I want to mention is, and we're very aware of this, there's a phenomenon occurring in California called copycatting. So if one municipality discovers a way to get voter approval for a new tax, we see that spreading all throughout the state. And so if the county imposes these taxes on growers and businesses in the unincorporated area, we have every expectation that each municipality may decide to do something similar, because both the county and all but 4 of the county cities share the same elephant in the room. They all share this staggering unfunded pension and health care obligation. And so you get confusion in the mind of the person as they wander around in the county making their purchases. Where do I pay the tax? Where do I not pay the tax? And the whole idea of this just being another in a series of ways of getting more tax money out of Contra Costa families' wallets.
Now, the range we read in the introduction said $1.7 to $4.4 million. That's a pretty wide range. Mm-hmm. How do we know, and the state has been taking in less marijuana tax revenue than projected, considerably less so far. So how do we know how much will really come in, and how reliable is that estimate?
Well, I trust the folks in our staff who put those numbers together, but that was a concern of my colleagues and I, because the state has not been taking in. In fact, they lowered their portion of the tax. And the issue is what we trying to find that sweet spot so that we don't send people to the black market, but that we just get the amount that we're needed for the enforcement and healthcare issues. Are we going to get into pension issues later, or can I address that now?
You can go ahead, but we will get into it, yes.
I understand the concern, because this is a general tax and it's not a special tax, therefore it goes into the kitty, so to speak. But it makes no sense if we get money in to do this and then we shift it over, which we wouldn't, but let's just assume for argument's sake we would shift it over to another cost. We'd still have the costs associated with the implementation of marijuana, and shifting it somewhere else takes it away from here. So the county is very dedicated that the money, and we've made it very clear, people can go back and look at our board agenda, that this will only go for that. And in addition, I'll wait till you ask your question on pension, because I do have some facts and figures on that.
We can get into that. So again, this wide range in the state, and as you said, one of the reasons the tax revenue is lower at the state level is because they underestimated how many people would not want to pay the tax and are instead buying marijuana on the black market the way they used to before. Do you think the 1.7 to 4.4 is a reliable estimate? Do you think?
I have no idea. And it's in a county budget of over $1 billion, you know, a few $1 million seems like, you know, something that's fairly minor. We really don't know what the costs of enforcement and that may vote entail. But and I can assure you that the average voter, by the time they reach this measure in their voter guide, that probably won't be a major concern for them either. But in the bigger picture, the issue from our perspective is that as the state, which is hugely unfunded in the pension obligation, shifts its traditional funding responsibilities down to local government, like the counties and like the cities. This is just one more instance of where, while our state taxes, if you look at the November ballot, there are several state proposals to increase state taxes, so the state continues to increase its taxes while shifting traditional funding for roads and highway maintenance and education onto local communities at the county and city level. So, incidentally, I want to make one thing perfectly clear. We do not always oppose any and all tax measures. We do actively support tax measures that make sense to us. On the other side of it, we do oppose tax measures that don't make sense to us in the best interest of the taxpayers, and Measure R just happens to be one of those.
So Jack is making the claim that part of the motivation of this is to pay for unfunded pension mandates. I want to get specifically into that in a moment, but before we get to that, can you explain to people, so what will the $1.7 to $4.4 million, can you break down a little bit for us what that money is supposed to pay for?
Well, as I said, and we are going to be very strict with our county department heads who come to us and say we've had additional workload because we've implemented this. We want facts and figures. I want statistics. I want to know if we had 10 deputy sheriffs and now you say you need 12, how have those 2 additional been utilized? What are they doing? In our health field, relative to substance abuse. There never is enough money. We do in Contra Costa County a fabulous job of leveraging our local dollar to state and federal grants. So we need money there. And as much as our budget, we have a very small what we call discretion over a very small portion of that budget. So environmental health, they are the ones that go out and do the inspections. So if you've been doing 100 inspections a year and now you're doing 150, I want to know that those 50 specifically went towards this industry. And so they're going to have to come back to us because we are the ultimate deciders of the budget, and once the money is collected, it's still under our jurisdiction of how it gets distributed back to the counties for the work that their staff are doing.
So that's the priority for where this money is supposed to go. What's your response to that?
Well, I want to say two things. One, just on a policy basis, when a government agency proposes a new sales tax or some other kind of tax, we like to see a sunset clause in that provision. In private industry, we constantly learn to find cheaper and more efficient ways of doing our job in order to keep costs down. So if something new comes along, like the legalization of cannabis, we understand that there may be a need for some period of time for additional expenses to manage and monitor that. But we also think government ought to find ways of working more efficiently. So we like to see a sunset clause. This has no sunset clause. This can and will go on forever. Secondly, and this is a major issue with many tax issues, this money is going into the general fund. And any future Board of Supervisors, for any reason, can decide to use this, any of the money in the general fund for any way they want. So even though Karen and her current colleagues can promise the voters it will be used only for enforcement and environmental inspection and whatnot, there is no guarantee that that's going to be the case. So the combination of no sunset clause and no security that this money can and only will be used for these purposes is one of the major reasons we think this is really a bad measure. If this was recrafted to address those, we would seriously consider it.
Do you want to respond to that?
Well, in a lot of tax measures, and I can give an example here in Contra Costa County, where what's considered a self-help county when it comes to transportation. So we had Measure C. It had a sunset clause, and we went back to the voters and said, along Jack's line, there's been innovations, there's been this, there's been that. So then we said, can we now continue it as Measure J? And they saw the results. We could point to the Caldecott Tunnel and the East Highway 4. So sunset clauses work in certain areas. This we see as an ongoing cost, and some of the I'll call them human costs, as much as we might innovate with record keeping or how we make sure business licenses are put out, those types of things that can be more modernized and computerized, you still need a person sometimes going out. And as much as we can innovate and save money, those costs go up too, just like in any business. Your overhead for salaries and benefits is always a proportion going up, and so that is why there's no sunset clause, although any future Board of Supervisors could repeal it. You mentioned earlier about what if we don't get enough money. I'm not sure it has to do with the black market. I think the proponents of legalizing marijuana were a little bit more liberal, again, a pun, in how many people they thought would utilize this product.
To inflate how much revenue the jurisdictions would get from the tax. I want to ask you about the pension question because you've brought it up quite a bit. Is that any part of the motivation behind this? And could the county take some of this revenue and say, oh, look, we have an extra $1 million, and apply it towards these other liabilities?
First of all, absolutely not. Contra Costa County is not a PERS county. PERS, I will agree with Jack, I sat on our Contra Costa County Employee Retirement Association, which we refer to as CESERA. We began addressing the problems that the state is just now addressing, and we did a pension obligation bond The counties, we've been paying down from over $2 billion down to currently the unfunded liability is $698 million just for Contra Costa County employees, and $131 million for our firefighters. These bonds will be paid off in 2022. So there's no incentive, since we're already paying it down on a schedule, and CESARA is currently funded at 80%. So I agree, a lot of our cities are going to be facing these major issues, and we here in Contra Costa have been ringing the bell for a long, long time. Relative, if there's an extra million, we could apply that to something, but I don't see how we're going to have any extra money, especially with the current revenue projections. I'm concerned that even with this passing, we're not going to have enough money to address the consequences of implementing the ordinance.
You want to respond to that, Jack?
Yeah. We identified unfunded public pensions as a major priority 3 years ago, and we have studied all 19 of the county cities, and we have studied the county itself. And what we find is, with the exception of those 4 Contra Costa cities who do not offer a guaranteed benefit plan, the cities collectively are over $1 billion in unfunded debt for their pension obligation. And I want to make a very important point. We take our figures from the official financial statements that are produced by CalPERS in the case of that particular pension fund, and in the case of the county, which has its own plan from CESARA. The cities are over $1 billion in debt for pensions. The county is also, as Karen said, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. If you combine those two together, because everybody lives, you know, in a city or in an unincorporated area, it represents an unfunded pension debt of thousands of dollars for every resident of this county. Secondly, the other point I want to make is, and I do want to give credit to CESARA for some of the actions they've taken recently to try to move this whole mess in the right direction. Most of the cities have not done that. So the point I want to make is, both in the case of the county's plan and in CalPERS in the cities, those unfunded pension figures and their estimates of the extent to which they're funded are based on assumptions regarding the return on their investments that the actuaries themselves say are unrealistically high. Now, Jerry Brown has warned for some time, we've been in an economic boom here in California for a while. It will not last forever. There should be, there can be, and there almost certainly will be a downturn. And when that happens, if those pension funds investments drop dramatically, then the unfunded debt will automatically rise. So we think there needs to be more done to address the pension issue. The phrase we use is, most government agencies have been kicking the pension can down the road for too long. So while giving credit to CESARA for what they're trying to do, we can't escape our reality, which is when we look at these tax measures on the November ballot, they may say it's for roads or public safety or marijuana management or this, that, but the elephant in the room is this enormous unfunded pension debt. And incidentally, that debt is for work that was performed in the past.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so I just want to ask you very quickly before we get to our closing statements. You raised the question of the tax might not generate enough revenue. What happens if it doesn't?
Then we will be underfunded in that, and we will have to adjust the budget. The problem is we are a service-oriented industry, if you will, and having worked for the county for almost over three decades, you ask your departments to look at what are mandated services that you have to provide and what are discretionary services. We're pretty much all at the mandated level, but there are discretionary services, and I'm sorry I can't just list them off the top of my head, but services get cut back. I can give you an example, libraries. I am a big proponent of libraries. Unfortunately, in this county many years ago, the county had to cut back how much money we could put towards library operations, and so we gave a flat 35 hours to every library. cities have then gone out and asked for taxes or this or that. Jackson, my hometown of Pleasant Hill, just did that recently, so that you can increase the hours. So those are the kinds of things and services that are discretionary that we would have to pull back on. I'm hoping that doesn't happen because one, well, I'll save it for my closing statement.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, thank you to our spokespeople for answering some of these important questions about Measure R. And now our proponent and opponent will each have 90 seconds to make a closing statement, and we will start with Jack Weir.
Thank you very much. I mentioned earlier that I'm suffering from tax allergies. I remember in 2016 we had 43 ballot measures in Contra Costa. Not all of those measures appear on each ballot. We had a flood of measures in the primary this year. We have 25 measures on the November ballot. It's very difficult for people to even keep up with this constant flood of ballot proposals. It's very difficult for people to even become knowledgeable about what are all these new tax things and how does all of this stuff work. Behind all of that is a major problem in California government at every level, where we're spending more than we can really afford to spend. I think we've raised some major issues with this particular cannabis proposal, and if it doesn't raise enough money, if it doesn't pass and we have to back off on the legalization, I'm okay with that, because I think it would make sense to really rethink this whole thing much more thoroughly, and incidentally do it on a county-wide basis in collaboration with those cities who have the ability to decide for themselves whether or not this really makes sense. Given the mobility of our population, I think that would make sense. So from a taxpayer's perspective, I think that this is one of those measures that voters should defeat, and I hope that they will vote no on this measure.
All right, thank you. And now in favor, Karen Mitchell.
Well, the number one argument, which was for the legalization too, is if you don't use the product, this isn't going to impact you as far as the use of the product. But here's how it could impact you if this tax, well, if it doesn't pass, as usual, we won't implement. But I've had a number of constituents come to me, forget the recreational aspect, they're looking at the medicinal aspect. And they don't want to have to go out of the county, and a lot of them have physical disabilities, and they want some relief, no pun intended either, here in Contra Costa County, so they don't have to travel so far. I understand, as Jack has mentioned again, voter fatigue on this, but we need, I don't know how much more to say it. It comes down to an issue of trust in government. And unfortunately, there's a lack of trust, and I understand that, but I can assure those who are watching and all of our constituents that we go through a very rigorous process on our budget development and how we expend funds. And these dollars that we hope to get through this will be used for what we're telling you. There's no reason not to.
All right, thank you so much. Thanks to both of our spokespeople for being here. And this concludes our forum on Measure R, the cannabis tax. For more information on the measures, please visit the website votersedge.org. And to view this broadcast online, go to www.cocovote.us. I'm Doug Sovereign, political reporter with KCBS Radio. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to vote on November 6th.